At the Lexington Federal Courthouse, a calm, black woman walks through the front doors, ready to begin her workday. But the security team doesn't recognize her, and they don't just stop her, they humiliate her. She's pulled from the line, dragged into a back room, and there, under the buzzing of clippers and mocking smirks, they shave her head, not for procedure, but as punishment. Every strand of hair that falls to the floor carries away a piece of her dignity, torn apart. What they don't know is that this woman holds a power far beyond what they could ever imagine, and her silence, it isn't weakness, it's the stillness before the storm. Judge Alexandria Rhodes, 52, with a steely face and deep eyes, isn't wearing a judge's robe, nor is she accompanied by an entourage. Just a charcoal gray coat draped lightly over a sleek navy suit, a small leather bag neatly in her left hand. Her silver-curled hair is neatly pulled back, the strands radiating like elegant wires of steel. No ostentation, no symbols of power, only the presence of someone who is all too familiar with corridors of authority and the silence of prejudice. She walks up to the security checkpoint, the same one she has passed through hundreds of times during her years presiding over trials. But today, instead of the familiar nods, she meets a different look. Colleen Briggs, the deputy sheriff in charge of courthouse security, stands right behind the scanner, arms crossed, her dark blue uniform hugging her tall frame. Colleen's icy eyes sweep Alexandria from head to toe as if she's assessing a criminal, not a high-ranking federal official. "No badge?" Colleen asks bluntly, without an ounce of politeness. Alexandria tilts her head slightly, her eyes revealing no emotion. "I have one," she replies, then slowly pulls out her federal judicial badge with a bright golden seal. But as she offers it, Colleen doesn't even bother to look, snatching it away and stuffing it into her own pocket without permission or inspection. The gesture feels nothing short of an insult. Not a word is spoken. The remaining security staff avert their eyes. The room seems to freeze in the invisible chill of abused power. Colleen smirks. "Who do you think you are? A lawyer? People who like to play these games usually hide stuff in their hair. Random check," she says, intentionally raising her voice as if to make sure everyone hears. Alexandria locks eyes with Colleen. Unafraid, unreactive. Only the silence of a storm brewing within. She's witnessed too many trials, too many uniforms hidden behind power, using it to demean others. But never did she think that one day she would find herself on the receiving end of such a public humiliation. Right here, in the very house of justice she's protected for decades. Colleen doesn't know who she's just touched. But Alexandria knows. Today will not end like any other. It will begin again, and someone will pay the price. The question that didn't need an answer, "Who do you think you are?" was not just a careless remark from Colleen Briggs, but an attitude, a deep-seated essence hidden in her assessing gaze, in the cold hand that grabbed the judicial badge and shoved it into her pocket as if it were just a worthless piece of paper. Colleen didn't need to verify, didn't need to check names or titles. To her, the well-dressed black woman could never be someone important. And because in her eyes Alexandria didn't look like a person of authority, it was assumed she must be controlled. The security room was at the end of a side hallway, an area not for the public, no cameras, no outsiders. Colleen pushed Alexandria towards it, past the hesitant glances of a few younger security officers who noticed something was wrong but lacked the courage to intervene. Alexandria didn't struggle or argue. She walked, with a calmness so strange it seemed as if she were guiding the woman into a mirror, where actions would reflect true natures. The metal door slammed shut behind them with a sharp clank. The room was bare, its gray steel walls cold to the touch, with a single metal chair in the center of the floor. a small table with inspection tools. Most notably, a pair of electric clippers neatly placed next to rubber gloves and a disinfectant spray. Colleen brushed her blonde hair behind her ear, removing her leather gloves before putting on a new pair of inspection gloves, each movement slow, deliberate, and cold. She wasn't in a hurry. She believed she held absolute power. "You know," Colleen said flatly, with a hint of mockery, "many people have hidden microphones, weapons, even drugs in their hair, especially with curly hair like yours. So, I'm going to need you to sit down." Alexandria stood still. Her voice was calm but sharp as a blade. "I do not consent to any searches without a clear order and legal basis. This directly violates my civil rights." Colleen smirked, stepping closer, her gray eyes observing with no hint of hesitation. "Keep up with your lawyer talk, but here," she tapped the police badge pinned on her chest, "I make the rules, and you will comply." This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was power nurtured by contempt, the belief that the system would always stand with her, as it always had. Colleen didn't act impulsively. She wasn't the kind of officer who lost control. On the contrary, she controlled herself very well, always knowing when to bend the law, when to sidestep it, and more importantly, when the victim wouldn't dare speak out. And this time, she was sure Alexandria would be just like the other black women dragged in here. Powerless, voiceless, unprotected. "Sit down," Colleen ordered again, her voice no longer pretending to be polite. She pulled out the clippers and turned them on, the buzzing sound echoing threateningly in the empty room. Alexandria remained motionless. Her silence was not submission. It was the calm before the storm. "This is a standard procedure. If you don't cooperate, I'll be forced to use coercive measures." Colleen stepped back half a step, signaling to a younger female officer to approach. The girl hesitated, clearly confused, but then stepped forward, placing her hand on Alexandria's shoulder as if programmed to do so. The air in the room grew heavy, like a stretched wire ready to snap. Alexandria slowly turned, her eyes briefly glancing at the equipment on the table, not in fear, just a flicker of disappointment. She sat down, not out of submission, but understanding that sometimes, in order to expose the truth, one must allow the guilty to confidently complete their actions. What Colleen didn't know was that as she turned on the clippers and moved toward the proud silver hair, she was sealing her own name into an unprecedented sentence in Lexington court history. And as the first locks of hair fell to the cold floor, history began to turn. The sound of the clippers echoed in the enclosed space like an emergency siren in a silent battlefield. There were no shouts, no cries of resistance from anyone in the room. Only the hum of the metal blades slicing through the air, and the quiet, stifled breaths, as if someone were witnessing a mute ceremony, not of justice, but of humiliation, carried out smoothly, methodically, as if it had happened many times before, and nothing about it was surprising. Colleen Briggs was in no rush. On the contrary, she seemed especially focused, as an artist before a block of marble preparing to sculpt. Her left hand lightly pressed against the top of Alexandria's head to hold it still, while her right hand lifted the clippers to the scalp, and with the first touch a silver curl slid down, gently falling to the floor, like a feather dropping from a bird trapped in a cage. But this wasn't freedom. This was theft, stealing dignity, symbols, memories, and the very identity of a person. "Don't think these curls can't hide anything," Colleen hissed through her teeth, eyes focused like an executioner who didn't need to strike quickly. She enjoyed the feeling of control. She liked when others were forced to sit still, unable to resist, especially with a black woman, especially when she remained calm, That calmness irritated her. It felt like a silent challenge she had never dared to face. And now, in this closed room, Colleen was determined to break it. But Alexandria didn't utter a sound. She sat still, her back straight, both hands resting on her thighs, fingers clenched white. Each time the blade touched her scalp, each time a curl was tossed aside, a childhood memory rushed back. Those days when her mother sat on the bench, carefully brushing each strand, telling stories of the black women who had fought, sacrificed, stood up, and kept their dignity in times when the world never gave them a chance. Alexandria remembered the times she'd brush her own hair before the mirror, smiling as she saw her mother's proud reflection in her own. Now, each piece of the past was being severed, falling like dead leaves under the boots of a conqueror. "Don't move," Colleen ordered, her voice not loud but firm, cold as steel. Alexandria didn't move, not out of fear, but because she knew sometimes what makes the enemy panic is not resistance, but absolute silence. A silence with purpose. A silence heavier than 1,000 screams. The female officer standing behind Colleen, a young woman named Emily Shaw, no older than 30, looked down at the floor. She held a pair of medical gloves but didn't know what to do. She didn't dare speak. She didn't agree with this, but she didn't dare oppose it. Her lips were pressed tight. She had been taught about standard procedures, but in police school there was no class on how to handle seeing an injustice right before her eyes from a superior. At that moment, a large curl fell, caught on Colleen's shoe. She kicked it away with the tip of her boot, a faint smirk on her lips. "Looks better now," she sneered, as if she'd just tidied up the hair of a prisoner in a jailhouse. A guard, standing near the door, Sergeant Kyle Moreno, considered the sensible one in the group, glanced at Alexandria, then quickly turned away. In his eyes was a mix of sympathy and fear, but absolutely no courage. And so they let it happen, allowing a black woman to sit motionless, as if a criminal in the back room of a federal courthouse shaved bald as an unspoken punishment. No paperwork, no official reason, no justification, only arrogance and malice wearing the name of power. Colleen had done this before, not shaving heads, not to that extreme. But she had forced women to remove their headscarves during Ramadan, made a black student remove her contact lenses because she thought they were disguising props, and asked elderly women to remove their bras during searches because they might hide weapons inside. She enjoyed the feeling of making others feel small, inferior, weak, and this time she thought she had done the same to another, just a woman who walked in and refused to obey orders. But what she didn't know was that the woman sitting there had the authority to make every door in that courthouse open or shut. And Colleen, in her arrogant sense of triumph, had dared to touch the one person she absolutely shouldn't have. Minutes later, the head-shaving process was finished. Colleen stood up, brushing the hair off her pants, her eyes surveying her work. Alexandria's scalp was now patchy, revealing dark skin lightly scratched in a few places, with blood oozing from where the clippers had been too close. But Alexandria remained still, her eyes showing no trace of fear. On the contrary, she lifted her head, looking Colleen directly in the eyes with a gaze as cold as ice, the gaze of a judge, not a victim. "You'll regret this," Alexandria repeated, this time not as a warning, but as an inevitable truth. Colleen scoffed. "I've heard that line 12 times, and people like you always disappear or come back begging for private apologies. That's how things work, and I'm always right." Then she turned away, pulling the judicial badge from her pocket and tossing it onto the metal table with a cold flick. "The courtroom is down the hall. Get there in time. she said, not looking back. The door to the room opened. No one stopped Alexandria, no one guided her. She stood slowly, picked up her badge, slid it back into her leather bag as if it had never been snatched away. She didn't fix her jacket. She didn't cover her head. Only her footsteps. Steady, sure, and as firm as the hammer of justice. And when her black leather shoes clicked against the cold stone hallway, each step echoed not as the footfalls of a victim walking away from humiliation, but as the footsteps of a woman walking toward the seat of power, where the one who humiliated her would soon bow their head. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind Alexandria with a deep, muffled sound, as if the entire building held its breath, waiting for something to explode. The hallway remained empty, eerily silent. Not the quiet of early morning, but the suffocating stillness after a crime had been committed and no one spoke up. The freshly shaved scalp of Alexandria throbbed in the cold wind blowing down the corridor. The tiny scratches on her head stung beneath the dry, cold air from the aging air conditioning. But she didn't raise her hand to touch it, didn't lower her head, didn't walk faster. She walked as if she had never been offended, as if she had chosen that very action herself. Her posture remained upright, her gaze unwavering, and each step, though heavy, was steady, like the beat of a drum marking the rhythm for an indictment slowly taking form. The last words before leaving that room still echoed in her mind. "You'll regret this." But what stuck with Alexandria wasn't her own words, but the look on Colleen Briggs's face when she heard them. The smirk of someone who believed that every wrong she had ever committed would remain buried, just like all the times before. Colleen stepped out a few minutes later, still as calm as if nothing had happened. She touched her belt, adjusting her gun holster, then glanced at her watch. A young security officer standing nearby quietly asked, "Is it done, Officer Briggs?" Colleen nodded slightly, then walked back to her post with decisive steps, without any hesitation. Colleen Briggs was not a disorganized person. She was a product of a system that allowed people like her to climb up on the silence of others. Starting as a patrol officer in a school district, she had learned early on that she didn't need to be the smartest or the most just. She only needed to be someone who wasn't challenged. And from the first day she received her badge, Colleen had learned one thing. If she spoke loudly, looked straight ahead, and appeared in control, people would believe she was right. No one wanted to question a cop in the middle of a courthouse. In her early years, she had made an Arab student cry quietly in the schoolyard for daring to refuse to take off her hijab. When the victim sued the city council, the file disappeared. When a single mother was pulled from the food line for looking the wrong way, Colleen simply needed an internal memo to shut it all down. And when a black intern wrote a report saying that she had been asked to sit in the back in a patrol car because someone needed to see the visual balance, no one cared. Colleen knew she was protected, not by the law, but by habit. The habit of a system that always turned a blind eye to abuses of power when it came from someone in uniform. She didn't fear Alexandria, because to Colleen, Alexandria was just one more black woman who would endure, leave, shrug it off, and forget. She had seen it happen dozens of times before. But there was one thing Colleen didn't realize. This time, the woman didn't step out as a victim. She walked out as a verdict wrapped in silence. Meanwhile, Alexandria continued walking toward the end of the hallway, where the shiny wooden door of courtroom 3B awaited. The faint sound of her heels clicking on the stone floor counted down the seconds like a ticking clock. No one in the hallway dared to look her in the eye. Some lowered their heads, others quietly avoided her gaze. Some wanted to say something, but the fear, not of Alexandria, but of the truth she carried, made them silent. Alexandria stopped before the door to the courtroom. In that brief moment, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The sting on her scalp mixed with the simmering anger rising like magma beneath hardened earth. No one could see the wound. No one could touch it. But she knew. It was real. And from that wound, she would build a trial no one could ignore. Colleen still had no idea about Alexandria's position. To her, the silver-haired woman was just someone humiliated, an unknown, nameless person who couldn't retaliate. But in just a few minutes, when she entered the courtroom, when she raised her head to the judge's bench and recognized the familiar face, the face she had once oppressed, once humiliated, Colleen would understand that she had just dug her own grave. At this moment, Alexandria reached out to open the wooden door. Inside, the rows of seats were filled with lawyers, defendants, plaintiffs, and a few reporters covering the hearing on the abuse of power by police officers in Lexington. She entered without a sound, but her presence, with her bald head, upright posture, and unflinching gaze, froze the entire room. Those who had thought she was merely a witness, a victim, an outsider, all turned to look at each other. Someone muttered, "Is it her?" At the left table, Deputy Chief Colleen Briggs stood alongside her colleagues and the attorneys representing the Lexington Police Department. When she heard the whispers around her, she turned her head, and in the instant their eyes met, Colleen froze. No words were spoken. No explanation was needed, because in that gaze, Colleen understood that the warning was not an empty threat. It was the truth rising before her, a mirror reflecting everything she had done, not just today but for 2 decades. And this time, it would not be covered up. The way Colleen Briggs' gaze froze when it met Alexandria Rhodes' face was like a silent verdict being read. No need for accusations, no need for evidence, only presence. In that moment, the cold from the ventilation system in the courtroom was no longer the coldest thing. It was the chill emanating from the soul of someone who had just realized they had crossed a line that could never be undone. Alexandria didn't look at Colleen again. She didn't stop to observe the stunned blinking, the mouths opening and closing, or the averted eyes of the former colleagues who had brushed past her for years but had never truly seen her. Because now, she was no longer a black woman walking into a place of power. She was the one redefining power. Courtroom 3. B greeted her with a tension so tight it felt like a string pulled to the breaking point, ready to snap into a sound that could shatter the silence. No one stood up to greet her. No one spoke. All they did was stare. Not because they didn't recognize who she was, but because they had recognized and didn't know what to do with that truth. The judge's robe still hung on the chair of the presiding judge, the same place she had left it the previous afternoon. A simple piece of black fabric, but to her it wasn't just a legal symbol. It was her spiritual armor, worn not to conceal the wounds, but to protect justice from the dirty hands that had long been accustomed to hiding behind silence. Alexandria walked toward the dark wooden chair, her hands grasping the edge of the robe as if preparing to lift a sacred relic. A slow, dignified motion, not dramatic, not grand, but anyone who watched could not take their eyes off her. She draped it over herself. Each fold of fabric falling was a statement without words. I have been humiliated, but I am not defeated. I have been hurt, but I have never been weak. And I am still here, exactly where I belong. The chair creaked slightly as she sat down, but that sound echoed like the first bell of a verdict. A young attorney on the plaintiff's side quietly set down his pen. A reporter adjusted his lens. A female witness unconsciously gripped the strap of her bag, and at the back of the room, Colleen Briggs took a step back. No one told her to do so. There was no commanding officer, no specific defensive instinct. But in the gaze that met her from Alexandria, now fully transformed into Judge Rhodes, there was something no one learned in police school: moral authority. Not the power that came from a badge or a job title, but the kind of power that makes others fear, because they know they are wrong. "Judge, shall we begin the hearing?" The court clerk's voice trembled slightly. Alexandria didn't turn her head. "Enter the record," she replied, her voice deep, steady, not loud, not fast, but each word as precise as a hammer striking stone. She looked around the room. Everyone was silent. No one even coughed. No one dared blink too quickly. The air, Alexandria had felt it in big trials before, but never had it been so thick. Because today, it wasn't just about prosecuting a case. Today, it was about prosecuting the very system that allowed Colleen Briggs to exist. Colleen was now standing near the defendant's bench between two police officers from the Lexington Police Department. Her hand rested on her belt instinctively, as she had been taught to project power. But now her gaze no longer dared to rise. The blonde hair, neatly tied behind her head, couldn't hide the sweat on her forehead. She had once entered a courtroom like a lion guarding its territory. But now Colleen was just a fox caught in daylight. The clerk began reading the case. Public Federal Hearing. Case number 487-L. Plaintiff. Citizen Joseph Banner and related parties. Defendant, Lexington Police Department, including officers such as Deputy Chief Colleen Briggs. And, as the names were repeated in the clerk's even voice, Alexandria's gaze stopped on each person. Not to condemn, but to remember. To remember each face, each silence that had contributed to the cut on her head this morning. When the clerk finished, Alexandria nodded slightly and opened the hearing. "We will begin with testimony from the plaintiff. Call the first witness," she said. An elderly veteran, his hair graying, stepped up to the witness stand, his left arm still in a sling. He bowed his head to the judge, his eyes briefly taken aback by the shaved head, but immediately understanding. His face stiffened, and his voice trembled as he recounted the night he was thrown to the sidewalk by an officer for simply holding a sign that read, "Justice is patriotism." Every detail, every kick, every mocking laugh he heard as he gasped for breath on the cold pavement was recounted before the court. And behind the judge's bench, Alexandria didn't furrow her brow, didn't shed a tear. She simply wrote, her pen steady, precise, cold. Not because she was indifferent, but because she knew. If she let her emotions take over right now, she wouldn't be able to withstand the next wave. When the second witness, a female student, told of being shoved face-first into the hood of a patrol car for recording police misconduct, Alexandria looked up. She glanced toward Colleen Briggs. For the first time in the trial, their eyes met. And this time, no words were necessary. Colleen Briggs understood. She would regret this. The moment Alexandria Rhodes' gaze met Colleen Briggs in the packed courtroom, it was no longer just about these two women. It was when the entire power dynamic of the room was stretched taut like a bowstring, waiting for a subtle flick to release everything that had been buried in the dark for far too long. Courtroom 3B, typically the venue for civil federal hearings, had hosted many cases about policies, contracts, and civil servant disputes. It had witnessed countless trials, from landmark rulings to cold procedural hearings. But today, the polished wood walls, the high presiding judge's bench, the rows of seats filled with reporters, lawyers, and plaintiffs, all of it seemed to carry a new, suffocating breath. The horror of when justice suddenly shows its true face without warning. The woman, humiliated that morning, Her head shaved, her dignity torn apart at the hands of a police officer, was now sitting in the most powerful seat in the room. And when Alexandria took that seat without announcement, without anyone calling her name, without a single word spoken, that in itself was the most terrifying statement. All those who had seen her as just another ordinary person, who had turned their backs when they saw her being escorted away, who had stayed silent out of fear of association, now they could not look away. They had to face it. Not just her, but the truth that this entire system had nurtured such behavior, allowed it to happen, and coldly ignored the consequences. In the corner of the room, Colleen Briggs, who only hours ago had held the power of control, now stood frozen, her face ashen. Dressed neatly in her Navy uniform, with her gun still at her hip and nameplate shining, she suddenly seemed small and out of place in the room she once walked through with such pride. She didn't know what to do, sit or stand, lower her head or walk away, apologize or stay silent. Every response was overshadowed by a single, crushing truth. She had made the gravest mistake of her life, humiliating a federal judge right in the courtroom she was entrusted to protect. The air in the room grew so heavy that even each breath seemed to make a sound. Even the clacking of journalists' keyboards disappeared. All that was left was a single, solitary sound. The voice of Alexandria rising in a calm, steady tone, with no need to raise it to carry weight. Begin the hearing. As the first testimony concluded, Alexandria nodded, taking notes, her eyes never leaving the speaker. But her gaze, seemingly able to penetrate every word, still lingered partly on where Colleen stood. Not to threaten, but to show Colleen clearly that she could no longer escape. Immediately after the second testimony, a young woman, only 23, speaking about being shoved face first into the hood of a patrol car for trying to record an unlawful arrest, the room fell silent again. The young woman didn't cry, but her neck trembled as she looked toward the defendant's table. And Colleen turned away. Judge Alexandria didn't say a word, but just by how she gently tightened her grip on the pen, everyone understood that her silence was not forgiveness. During the break, most people quietly left to get some air, but Alexandria stayed seated. No one told her to leave. No one dared approach. Only one person remained unmoving, Colleen Briggs, still standing motionless by the side door, hands on her hips, as if trying to keep herself from collapsing. When the room was down to just Alexandria, 2 security officers and Colleen, Alexandria slightly tilted her head toward the clerk. "Call Deputy Officer Colleen Briggs for internal testimony." No one objected. No one coughed. No one stood to defend her. Colleen swallowed hard. She stepped toward the center of the room like a child called to the front of the classroom for lying. Only now, all eyes were no longer on her. They were all on the person sitting on the judgment seat. "Deputy Officer Briggs," Alexandria spoke, not loudly, but clearly, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "Please tell us, this morning, who did you conduct a search on in Security Room C?" Colleen stood tall, her hands behind her back as a military habit, but her posture slouched, as if she couldn't bear the weight of the question. She tried to speak clearly. "I searched an individual who didn't have a visible badge and displayed initial non-cooperation." "Who was that individual?" Colleen paused. No one could save her now. No record could erase the surveillance video that had been extracted and sent to the Department of Justice as soon as the incident spread on social media this morning. No system could shield her anymore. Finally, Colleen lowered her head. "Judge Rhodes." Silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of something just collapsing, like an old wooden pillar eaten through by termites, and with the slightest touch, it all comes crashing down. Alexandria didn't react. She nodded slightly and made the entry into the record. Continue the testimony. At the defendant's table, one of the three lawyers stood up, intending to interrupt, but then looked around and sat back down. No one wanted to align themselves with Colleen anymore, because now, in the entire room, no one dared turn their back on the justice quietly sitting at the bench. The seemingly simple phrase, "The hearing will begin," rang out like a slow thunderclap in the already thick tension of the room. But when it came from the mouth of Alexandria Rhodes, in her newly draped judge's robe with her hands firm, it was no longer just a procedural statement. It was a declaration of war, the beginning of a trial that wasn't merely about judging actions, but about reassessing an entire system that had long avoided responsibility. The presiding judge's seat was no longer an inanimate wooden chair polished weakly. Under the gaze of everyone in courtroom 3B, it had become a battlefield. A battlefield where Alexandria was the warrior, not armored in steel, but in poise and integrity. As she declared the first defendant's name to be placed on the list, Deputy Officer Colleen Briggs, a wave of silence swept through the space. No whispers, no objections. Even the defense lawyers from the Lexington Police Department, three well-dressed white men who had entered the room with near overflowing confidence, sat motionless, their eyes glued to their paperwork as though trying to avoid their own consciences. Colleen lifted her head. She was no longer in control. The shoulders that had been so straight when she entered now sagged. Her blonde hair at the back of her neck was slightly disheveled, sweat collecting at her temples. Her gaze was no longer the arrogant one from the morning, but the confusion of someone lost in their own fortress, thinking they had been in command. Deputy Officer Briggs, Alexandria spoke, her voice even and low. Do you know why your name is listed first among the defendants? Colleen hesitated. She glanced at her lawyer, but no one spoke. A long moment of silence stretched throughout the room. Finally, she answered in a hoarse voice, because of what happened this morning. Specifically, what happened? Alexandria pressed, refusing to let her hide behind vague words. Colleen swallowed hard. Because I acted inappropriately with a citizen. Inappropriately, Alexandria repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but because she was used to this kind of legal loophole language. I was forced into the security room, she said, her voice still calm. My hands were restrained without a warrant. My head was shaved with no records made, no independent witnesses. When I objected, what did you say? Colleen fell silent. Alexandria didn't need her to answer. She turned to the court clerk. Play the excerpt from the 2C hallway security camera at 8:13 this morning. The screen behind the court lit up. In a few seconds, everything that had only been rumors, recounts, or written statements now became clear, vivid images. Colleen Briggs, tall and holding a federal judicial badge, refusing to comply, then grabbing it roughly and shoving it into her pocket. She said, "Random check. Follow me." A part of the audio was muffled, but it was clear there was no request for permission, no procedure, no attempt to verify identity before acting. The entire room was glued to the screen. No one moved. Alexandria didn't turn around to look. She had already seen this video several times before entering. She didn't need to look back at what had been ripped from her head to know what it had taken. When the clip ended, she asked, "Do you still claim this was a standard procedure, Officer Briggs?" Colleen mumbled, "No, Your Honor." Then why did you carry it out? The question hung in the air. No one answered for her, and the silence grew even heavier as Alexandria gently added, "I'll help you remember. Because I wasn't wearing a name tag, because I'm a black woman, and because in your eyes I didn't look like someone with authority." Alexandria's gaze swept across the room. It carried no anger. It carried the cold certainty of truth, requiring no raised voice, no further evidence, just presence. In 18 years working in this court, how many times have you conducted such random checks? Colleen stiffened. How many women have been asked to remove their headscarves? How many have been forced to sit in metal chairs, threatened with tools like prisoners, without breaking any laws? How many times has this system let you off because none of them had the power to make you answer? No one spoke. No one clicked their pens, not a single deep breath. Colleen was now just the shadow of old power, the kind she had once wielded with confidence, but never truly deserved to carry. And now, the chair that Alexandria was sitting in, the very chair Colleen had once thought was just another familiar piece of furniture, became the sword hanging over the wrongdoer's head. "You are not being called here for the actions of one morning," Alexandria said slowly. "You are being called because of an entire pattern that has nurtured those actions. And today it ends." She gestured to the court clerk to make the record. "I move to suspend Deputy Officer Colleen Briggs immediately, to transfer the file to the Department of Justice, and to launch an internal investigation into all complaints in the past 10 years related to the defendant." The motion was recorded. No one objected. No one dared. When Alexandria placed her pen down and looked up, her gaze seemed to pierce through every mask, every uniform, every layer of deception within the system. And that was when everyone realized. The chair wasn't just power, it was a vow, and today it had been kept in full. As the following testimonies were presented, the courtroom became a curtain being torn open. It was no longer a place for the plaintiff and defendant to exchange formalities, nor a stage for lawyers to argue their cases. Today, it was where buried memories were unearthed, hidden fears were named, and those accustomed to living in the shadows were forced to step into the light. Alexandria Rhodes sat upright behind the presiding judge's desk, her gaze composed, each movement of her hand as steady as the workings of justice itself. But everyone could see, though her face showed no emotion, the cracks in her eyes were as clear as a blade cutting through fogged glass. She listened. She took notes. And occasionally she glanced over at Colleen Briggs, not to threaten, but to remind her that every word spoken was a brick in the rebuilding of a system that Colleen had helped corrupt. On the witness stand, Joseph Banner, 68 years old, frail, his left arm in a brace, spoke in a deep but steady voice. He recalled the night he stood before the square holding a sign that read, "Justice is patriotism." It wasn't his first protest, but it was the first time he was thrown onto the street like a bag of trash simply for looking defiant. The person who shoved him was none other than an officer listed in the internal records, and the officer in charge at that moment was Colleen Briggs. Joseph's gaze met Alexandria's as he finished his testimony. There were no tears, no bitterness, just quiet gratitude, for at last someone had made the system listen. The next witness was Leona Price, a senior college student. Black hair, sharp eyes, her voice stronger than her years. She recounted the afternoon she was pulled off the sidewalk while filming the police arrest her boyfriend, who was later charged with resisting arrest, simply for asking why he was being stopped. Leona didn't shout in the courtroom, but every word she spoke pierced through the skin of a truth that had been hidden for too long. When Leona told how she had been forced face first onto the hot hood of a patrol car during the midday heat, Alexandria slightly raised her head. "Can you identify the officer who directly carried out that act?" Her voice rang out, steady, unwavering. Leona glanced over at the defendant's table. Then she pointed directly. It was her. Her finger didn't tremble, and it pointed straight at Colleen Briggs. The room nearly stopped breathing. Colleen sat between two lawyers, but no one next to her spoke. Her hands, resting on her thighs, were now clenched into fists. Her fingertips were white. Her right foot twitched, uneven, a habit those who knew her would recognize. It was the moment Colleen felt she was losing control. Alexandria stared at her for a long time. Then she turned to the court clerk. "Record the direct accusation from the second witness. Retrieve the patrol records from July 14th, including the officer's body camera footage and the deployment orders signed by Deputy Officer Briggs." One of the defense lawyers, a man named Graham Wheeler, flipped through documents quickly, then stood up as if jolted by electricity. "Your Honor, I object to accessing internal records without an official subpoena from the defense." Alexandria interrupted, her voice not loud but sharp as a knife cutting through silk. "The subpoena was signed this morning at 9:42 when the security camera footage was transferred to the Federal Civil Rights Office." She paused, then looked directly at Graham. "You're not objecting to retrieving the records. You're objecting to being exposed." A few people in the room exhaled lightly, almost instinctively, as if freed from the pressure choking their throats. Graham sat down. No more words. Alexandria turned to Colleen. She didn't call her name. No need. But that look was enough to make Colleen understand. The unmasking had officially begun, and her mask was the first to go. "Deputy Officer Briggs," Alexandria spoke, "in the last 10 years, there have been at least 12 complaints related to racial discrimination, abuse of power, and bodily harm under the guise of security checks, filed with the court's Human Resources Department." She pulled out a thick stack of yellowed files, tapping them lightly on the desk. "Every single one has your name on it, and every single one was dismissed because there was insufficient evidence or because the complaint was unclear." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "Quite a coincidence, isn't it?" Colleen didn't answer. "And also, quite strange," Alexandria continued, "that of those 12 complaints, 10 were filed by black women, including a 17-year-old girl who was forced to remove her headscarf, a pregnant mother who was forced to sit on the floor for unusual movement, a public school teacher who was groped in public without any search warrant." By now, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from silence to suffocating tension. Everyone understood. This was no longer just Colleen's issue. This was about a mechanism protecting misconduct by turning a blind eye. And the woman sitting in the presiding judge's seat was peeling back each layer, each figure hiding behind Colleen, thinking they could remain in the dark. "And this morning," Alexandria said slowly, "you shaved a federal judge's head. No one dared blink. You didn't know who I was. That doesn't matter. But what matters is, you didn't care. Because if I were just an ordinary black woman, this humiliation would have been buried in silence, just like those 12 complaints. Isn't that right, Officer Briggs?" Colleen tightened her grip on her belt. Her face was drained of color. "We will no longer have silence," Alexandria said, her voice nearly a whisper. "And today is just the beginning." She placed the stack of files back on the desk. No further declarations were needed. The unmasking had begun, and it would not stop until no one could hide behind badges and uniforms anymore. After a day of tension so thick it seemed paralyzing, only a few remained in the courtroom. The reporters had retreated to meet their evening deadlines. The lawyers and witnesses had left, carrying heavy glances and whispered words that had yet to form. Only a few court staff, 2 judicial officers, the clerk, and the one person who couldn't yet step away from the defendant's seat within her own heart, Deputy Chief Colleen Briggs. The soft yellow lights cast a glow over the stains on the old wooden walls. Outside, the evening shadows had already crept across the square. But inside the courtroom, the light still shone directly on the judge's bench, not just illuminating Alexandria Rhodes, but now focusing squarely on the woman sitting still beneath the defendant's bench. Alexandria didn't need to raise her voice, bang the gavel, or call for security or advisors. Her voice was enough for the entire room to hear clearly, but it was deep enough to feel like a sharpened blow, honed beforehand. Deputy Chief Colleen Briggs, step forward. No one moved. No one dared ask for a reprieve. No one requested a recess. No colleague came to stand beside her. Every seat had become an empty void. In the silence, as heavy as stone, Colleen Briggs stood alone. She no longer carried the same poise she had in the morning, when she had dragged the quiet black woman into the security room with a smug smile at the corner of her mouth. Now, she walked as if heading toward her own mental execution, each step weighed down by her reputation, her badge, and the times she had silenced victims thinking it was a victory. Colleen stopped in the middle of the courtroom, exactly where witnesses usually stood to answer questions. Only this time, the one questioning was a victim, a judge, and a living witness all at once. Alexandria didn't look down at her from above. She kept her gaze at eye level. Not to assert power, but to force Colleen to look directly into her eyes. No head bowed, no retreat into the shadows as she had done before. "Deputy Officer Briggs," Alexandria began, her voice calm. "Do you remember the complaint from Ms. Fatima Khalid in 2018? Colleen flinched slightly. Alexandria continued. She wrote that she was asked to remove her hijab at the checkpoint, despite presenting valid paperwork and requesting a female officer to conduct the search. The report reads, "Request denied due to lack of personnel and suspicion about identity. Do you remember?" Colleen struggled to regain her composure, speaking softly. "I don't remember the details clearly." Alexandria tilted her head, turning a page in the file. "But your name was the one that signed off on the denial. And I have an audio recording from the hallway camera where you said, 'This is America. If you want to wear a headscarf, you should go back home.'" She placed the file down, not tapping the table, not emphasizing. She didn't need to. Colleen fell silent. Her face was stiff, her hands limp at her sides. No one could save her now. "March 2020, Alexandria continued. "You forced a 7-month pregnant woman to sit on the floor of the security room for suspicious concealment of metallic objects. The scanner showed it was a medical back brace. Do you remember?" Colleen pursed her lips, only shaking her head. "That time," Alexandria said, "the woman suffered cramps and collapsed on the spot. You didn't call for an ambulance for 12 minutes. Her child, named Elijah, nearly suffocated due to lack of oxygen. What did you say then?" Colleen still didn't answer. "You said no one forced you to be pregnant and go through a checkpoint during rush hour." This time, both judicial officers standing on either side of the courtroom visibly shuddered. Alexandria paused for a moment. "And this morning," she continued, her voice unchanged, "you shaved a black woman's head. No asking her name, no checking documents, no data verification, no report made, no independent witnesses. She leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping to a whisper, but each word was as sharp as steel. That woman was me. Colleen could no longer hide her emotions. Her face was not just pale, it trembled visibly. One of her hands curled in, her fingers twisting unnaturally. Her lips moved, as if trying to say something. An apology, a defense, a denial. But Alexandria didn't let her speak. "And if I weren't a federal judge," Alexandria continued, "what would have happened? I would have been taken outside with a shaved head and the sound of laughter behind me. I would have become a topic for the morning coffee break of the duty staff. An internal file would have been written, marked suspected non-cooperation, and tucked away like the 12 other cases. And you would have continued working, repeating it, forgetting the names of the women you humiliated. Isn't that right, Officer Briggs?" Colleen hung her head. It wasn't just avoidance anymore, it was collapse. No one in the room spoke. Even the 2 judicial officers looked away, as if trying to stop themselves from reacting emotionally. But Alexandria didn't turn away. She sat up straight, her eyes never leaving Colleen, then spoke, slowly, clearly. "Effective immediately. You are suspended. I will file charges with the Civil Rights Office and the Department of Justice within 24 hours. You will be arrested in court with no access to any law enforcement agencies, and you will never wear that badge again." Colleen looked up one last time. Her eyes were red, her mouth opened as if to say something, but Alexandria gently spoke. "No need to say anything else. It's enough." She turned to the 3 court staff. "Please escort Deputy Officer Briggs out of the courtroom." And so, Colleen Briggs, the woman who had once walked through countless doors of power with arrogance, was escorted by 2 officers through the very door she had forced others to pass through. No glory, no badge, no power. Only the truth, walking alongside her, slowly, like a shadow that had nothing left to hide. The sound of the handcuffs locking echoed in the courtroom, not loud, but enough to tear apart the silence that had settled over the room, a silence no longer born of fear, but of witness. It was the moment when everyone present in that room saw something they never thought they would. A person in uniform, shielded by the system for years, now being submerged by the very justice she had once twisted. Colleen Briggs did not resist. She stood there, her wrists behind her back, where the cold cuffs clicked slowly into place. Her fingers, once wielding control in the security room, now trembled as though they could no longer feel the blood flowing to them. The silver badge on her left chest, the symbol of power and immunity, now reflected the light in the courtroom with a stark honesty. It was no longer a symbol of glory but a relic. Alexandria did not turn away. She kept her eyes locked on Colleen as she was led from her position, step by step, silently, heavily, like a mirror of the many, even hundreds of steps Colleen had forced others to take. Only this time, she was no longer the one giving orders. She was the one who had to obey them. There was no applause, no cheers, no mocking laughter. Because this was not a victory. This was rightful punishment. And sometimes it is the solemn silence that carries the loudest sound. Colleen passed by the defendant's table. Her colleagues, who had once sat beside her, those who had remained silent throughout the trial, who had averted their eyes from Alexandria, who had relied on clauses, precedents, and the reason of insufficient evidence to dismiss complaints, now sat upright as though someone had struck them on the back of the neck. No one stood up. No one wished her good luck. Not a single farewell glance. The heavy iron door closed behind her, and as it clicked shut, It seemed that it wasn't just the end of Colleen's presence in the room, but the end of an era of silence, of shielding, of wrongful acts veiled by process. Alexandria exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, but because at last the truth had found its rightful place. On the bench, visible, spoken, and protected. She lowered her head slightly, a silent gesture for the victims who could not be present, the ones who had been pushed out of the security line, wrongly called by another name, humiliated without ever being given the chance to reclaim their dignity. Then she raised her head and looked toward the court clerk. "Please record," Alexandria spoke slowly, but with weight. "Case number 487L, November 14th this year. Defendant, Deputy Chief Colleen Briggs. The sentence is established under federal jurisdiction for the following crimes: abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and bodily assault without a search warrant." She paused for a beat, then continued. "Considering the repeat offenses, the systemic nature of the actions, and the consequences for the victims and the community, the court rules 6 years in prison for abuse of power in law enforcement, 5 years in prison for violation of civil rights with racial discrimination, 1 year in prison for obstruction of a federal investigation." No one moved. The numbers weren't a triumph. They were a mirror held up to everyone present, reminding them that silence is also a form of complicity. And Alexandria, with that sentence, had begun a cleansing not only of Colleen, but of an entire system that had long condoned wrongdoing. She sat back in her chair, her hands resting neatly on the cold wooden desk. "That is the legal part," she continued, her voice now lower. "Now for the humanitarian part." Everyone lifted their heads. Some froze with their hands still on the armrests. Some paused from tapping their pens. Colleen Briggs spent 18 years standing at the gate of justice, not to protect it, but to decide who was worthy of entering. She decided who was a threat, who was a suspicious subject, who needed further inspection. And she did this not based on evidence but on skin color, religion, and gender. Each word, each pause, landed like a hammer striking the foundation of justice now being re-established. She used fear to control. She used the silence of the system to fortify her power, and when questioned, she hid behind her title, her process, and her privileges. But today, those shields no longer hold. Alexandria leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room. Today, she is no longer an officer. She is no longer a symbol. She is a person, and like all of us, she must be held accountable. She nodded slightly as though sealing the final stamp. "Take her away." The door opened. 2 judicial officers stepped in. One nodded to confirm, and within seconds, Colleen Briggs, the woman who had made dozens of women feel unworthy of entering the courtroom, was escorted out of the very courtroom she had once pushed others to walk through. This time, it wasn't to maintain order. It was to restore it. The silence that enveloped the courtroom after Colleen Briggs was escorted out was not an empty void. It was a sacred stillness, as if everyone was waiting for something. Not for the end, but for the beginning. And Alexandria Rhodes understood this more than anyone. She sat back down in the judge's chair, her hands resting lightly on the smooth wooden desk that had witnessed countless trials in her life, but perhaps never one where a verdict was both a punishment and a birth certificate for a new order. She took a deep breath, then gently extended her hand to the court clerk. A thick file, neatly bound in a gray cover, was placed in front of her. On the cover, the italicized black lettering stood out. Comprehensive Court Security Reform Proposal, the Rhodes Act. No need for introductions, no need for permission. Alexandria opened the file, flipped to the first page, looked up at the room, and spoke in a clear, deliberate voice. Based on the events that took place this morning, the verifiable evidence from testimonies, records, and surveillance videos, based on the complaints that have been ignored by the system for years, I hereby announce and present to the Federal Court of Lexington the proposal, the Roads Reform Act. The room remained silent. But this was no longer the silence of waiting for fear or a storm. It was the quiet of a community ready to embrace change. Alexandria stood. She didn't rush her words, didn't lecture. Each clause was presented clearly, with the voice of someone who would not allow this to happen again. Section 1. All security personnel within the court's premises, including security check staff, supervising officers, and hallway patrol teams, are required to participate in biannual training sessions on unconscious bias and systemic prejudice. An elderly law clerk sitting at the back of the room nodded subtly. He had once witnessed a brown-skinned employee being detained for carrying a bento box. The reason, suspicious smell, possibly containing sedatives. Section 2. Establishment of a multi-tiered anonymous reporting system, allowing employees and citizens to file complaints directly to the Civil Oversight Committee, without intermediary internal management. A logistics officer near the door exhaled with relief. She had once been questioned by Colleen during lunch break for looking the wrong way at an off-duty officer. Section 3. Mandatory installation of surveillance cameras in all private screening areas. No staff shall have private interactions with citizens in areas lacking video recording, except in medical screenings with independent medical personnel and accompanying supervisors. A faint grunt escaped from an older court staff member. He had heard about the unnamed incidents in Room 4B, but had never dared to ask. Section 4. Formation of an independent community oversight board, including lawyers, former judges, civil rights representatives, and at least one member from local minority groups. The board will have the authority to propose termination, suspension, or internal investigation of any personnel with suspicious behavior. A group of 3 law students sitting at the back, originally there just to observe, now hurriedly opened their notebooks, scribbling down everything. They knew they were witnessing something far greater than a trial. Section 5. Implementation of a zero-tolerance policy for any acts of racial, religious, gender, or disability discrimination, including actions that, while not criminal, cause psychological harm, damage to reputation, and emotional safety for citizens within public spaces. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. And finally, all past violations or complaints that were previously dismissed for administrative reasons will be reopened, reviewed, and publicly addressed before the independent board. No exceptions. At this point, one of the defense lawyers, who had sat silently through the morning, shifted slightly in his seat. He was about to speak, but then sat back down. Perhaps because he understood. Any defense now would be redundant. Alexandria closed the file. She looked up, her voice now softer, but no less sharp. This is not a law for revenge. This is a law to remind us that justice does not live in brick walls or written documents. It lives in the actions of those who uphold it. And if one who guards justice becomes corrupted, the entire system must be examined. Starting today. Still, no one spoke. But the eyes on her now were different, no longer filled with respect for her position or pity for her shaved head. These were the eyes of people ready to stand up because they had just seen someone willing to clean the rot in the place that should have been the cleanest. A young clerk whispered to a colleague, "This is no longer the old Lexington Federal Court." The other nodded. "Number now, it is the Rhodes Court." The news spread like wildfire across dry grass. Unstoppable. and no one dared to turn a blind eye anymore. When the trial ended and the Rhodes Reform Act was announced, national media erupted. Special reports on CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News all covered the event. A judge shaves her head and rebels by overturning the entire system. But what stood out was not the headline. What truly awakened America was how Alexandria Rhodes transformed an act of humiliation into a collective awakening. The next morning, as the sky lightened, crowds gathered outside the Lexington Federal Courthouse. No orders were given. No leaders stood at the front. But people came. Small groups, individuals quietly carrying something with them. Dismissed complaints, old photographs, pieces of evidence once scorned, or simply a look no longer willing to accept injustice. An elderly veteran, frail and leaning on a cane, sat quietly on the courthouse steps, holding a sign. I was thrown to the ground like trash. Today, I stand with justice. A young mother, holding her small child, brought a file bag. In 2015, I was denied entry to the courthouse because my baby cried too loud. A middle-aged Arab man, wearing a worn shirt, stepped out from the crowd and quietly handed a court clerk a file, kept in an old plastic folder. I was forced to strip because they said my wife's scarf might be a disguise. No one shouted. No one vandalized. But the silence was no longer one of submission. It was solidarity. And for the first time in years, no one turned away thinking their complaints would be crushed by procedure. Inside, from the third floor of the building, Alexandria stood looking down through the large window. She wasn't wearing her robe. She didn't carry any folders or notes. She was just a woman with a freshly shaved head, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep, but glowing with something she had never seen before. Trust from the community. Outside, a teenage girl, about 16, also with a shaved head, stood in the crowd. She didn't say a word, didn't hold a sign, didn't approach the group. She simply looked up at the window where Alexandria stood. Their gazes met through the glass. Alexandria smiled. And when the girl smiled back, Alexandria saw everything she needed to hear. You didn't just shave my head. You taught me to hold it high. In that moment, Alexandria understood the justice she was building wasn't in laws hammered out with a gavel, nor in thick files of paperwork. It was alive, it breathed, through the people who had once been forced to bow their heads, now standing tall in the middle of the square. As she descended the stairs to the main hall, the crowd automatically parted. Not because she was a judge, not because she had just convicted an officer, but because she was the first person to give them back their voice. An elderly woman in a long coat walked up to her, took her hand, and choked back tears. You don't know me, but I've lived long enough to see many people silenced because they had no standing. Today, I know, there is someone who stands with us. A white law student, blonde hair tied back, held up a handwritten sign. I used to believe the system was enough. Now I understand. The system has no heart. We have to give it back. Inside the hallway, Jasmine, the loyal court clerk who had stood by Alexandria throughout the trial, came up to her with red eyes. The proposal has been sent to 2 other federal courts. And the Civil Rights Office, they called back. They said they're reopening 6 old dismissed complaints. They want to talk to you. Alexandria didn't respond immediately. She looked around at the crowd, then nodded slowly. It's not about talking to me, she said. They need to hear from all these people. They are the most important testimony. And from that day forward, no day passed without people gathering in Lexington Square. A brown-skinned woman set up a free water station for those waiting to submit their complaints. A former police officer started a group to support legal victims. a group of law students organized to record testimonies from those who didn't know how to write complaints. Each person contributed a brick, and a new kind of justice, one not built by power but by collective awakening, began to take shape. As the wave of civil unrest spread beyond Lexington, beyond the scope of a single case, the federal government could no longer remain on the sidelines. On the third morning, just 2 days after the verdict on Colleen Briggs had been rendered, an unmarked SUV convoy pulled up outside the Lexington Federal Courthouse. No sirens, no noisy escort, but their presence, with gray suits and folders embossed with federal seals, spoke volumes. Alexandria was in her office when Jasmine, the trusted clerk, walked in, her expression more serious than usual. "They're here," she said quietly. Alexandria folded her file, stood up, and walked out into the hallway without surprise. She had been waiting for this moment since the first day she sat in the judge's chair, but not for the glory. She had been waiting to see the truth set in motion from the highest level, not buried under paperwork or politics. In the second-floor conference room, Carlton Devereaux, the Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division, entered with the demeanor of someone who had witnessed too many systemic scandals. But this time, he didn't carry the usual skepticism. "We've collected all the surveillance footage from that morning, witness testimonies, copies of the complaints that had been dismissed over the last decade," he said, his voice low and resolute. "And we have officially opened a federal investigation." He pulled a long list from his briefcase, revealing the official seal of the U.S. Department of Justice. The list didn't just have Colleen Briggs' name on it. Alexandria glanced over, and on the 3rd, 4th, and 8th lines were names she had known for a long time. The former senior judge who had said, "Briggs has a good record, no need to review the first complaint." The HR director who had asked Alexandria to wait for more evidence before submitting the complaint. The regional court's internal director, who had signed off on a raise for Briggs just 1 week after a Muslim woman's complaint, lost its file. Each name, each position was a link in the chain, and now that chain was being pulled into the light. "We're not just investigating personal behavior," Devereaux continued. "We're investigating the cover-up mechanism, the falsification of records, and biased hiring and promotion decisions along with systemic racial discrimination." He looked up, meeting Alexandria's gaze. "We will need your full cooperation." Alexandria didn't blink. Her voice was calm but colder than usual. "Start with those who promoted her." The room fell silent. Not because they were surprised, but because, from now on, no one could deny it anymore. Because for Colleen Briggs to have existed for 18 years, she couldn't have done it alone. And now, no one was allowed to hide in quiet offices anymore. That afternoon, 3 senior officials from the Lexington Regional Court were summoned. Not in closed meetings, but right at the main offices, with civil observers present at Alexandria's request. One was Federal Judge Barrett, who had previously refused to hear the complaint of a high school student who was detained by Colleen for walking improperly. Another was Deputy Security Chief Troy Halpern, who had dismissed Colleen's complaint 3 times with the same reasoning. Insufficient evidence. And the third, Regional Administrator Mallory Keene, who had signed an internal memo preventing any complaints from reaching higher than the deputy security level. None of them sat in the defendant's seat. Not yet, but Alexandria knew. The time would come. In the meeting that lasted over 3 hours, each trace of the cover-up was traced back like a map leading to where power had once sheltered. Nothing was accidental. No record was lost. Every time a complaint was lost, someone had pressed the delete button, and each time it was another step pushing justice off the scales. And now, Alexandria, The woman who had once been dragged into a room without cameras, shaved like a criminal, was pulling each person who had turned a blind eye into the light. Devereaux ended the meeting with an informal promise. This is not an investigation driven by public pressure. This is an investigation to correct a part of history, and we will not stop until it is done. Alexandria nodded, but instead of saying thank you, she simply replied, "Don't end it before I call the last name." Because she knew the reform wouldn't stop with Colleen. It wouldn't stop in Lexington, and only complete justice would be the final verdict. The final trial closed in a silence thick as the calm before a great storm, leaving behind scars that couldn't be hidden, but also clearing the sky for those brave enough to look straight ahead. Colleen Briggs stood before the defendant's podium, no longer in uniform. Instead, she wore a glaring orange prison jumpsuit, the color she had once thought only fit for the oppressed. Now, it clung to her like a shell that couldn't be removed, not because of the material, but because of the meaning. Alexandria Rhodes sat in the judge's seat without needing to bang the gavel for respect, without raising her voice to assert her authority. Everyone in the room understood her calmness was the heaviest sentence for Colleen. Based on the evidence presented, witness testimony, surveillance footage, internal records, and documents collected from the Civil Rights Department. Alexandria began, her voice steady and deep. The Lexington Federal Court sentences the defendant, Colleen Briggs, to a total of 12 years in prison, divided as follows: 6 years for abuse of power in the execution of official duties, 5 years for serious violations of citizens' civil rights, 1 year for obstruction of justice, including concealing evidence, pressuring witnesses, and destroying internal data. There was no murmuring. No one dared breathe loudly. Because they knew this verdict was not just for an individual, but a warning bell for the entire system. But Alexandria didn't stop there. She gently leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Colleen, now standing tall but trembling, her hands clenched as if this was the last thing she could control. "Colleen Briggs," Alexandria's voice rang out, no longer just reading a verdict, but speaking the final words between a person who enforces justice and someone who had trampled it. "You spent 18 years of your life deciding who deserves respect and who doesn't. You took it upon yourself to determine others' worth by their appearance, by their skin color, by their hair, by the way they walked through the security checkpoint." Colleen lowered her head, but Alexandria wouldn't let her hide. "No, look at me." Colleen raised her eyes. Her gaze was no longer cold. It was filled with tears. But there was no anger in Alexandria's eyes, only the truth, brutal, but necessary. "You took my hair as a way to strip away my dignity," Alexandria said, her voice still low but every word landing like a hammer striking the core. "But you cannot shave my worth, and now I don't punish you as a victim of humiliation. I sentence you as someone who wants to teach you that dignity is not something to be decided. It is something that must be preserved, even for those who have lost it." A moment of silence. All eyes were on Alexandria, then on the defendant. "You will live as someone who no longer has the right to choose who stands up," Alexandria concluded. "You will live as a person who must pay the price. No longer an officer, no longer a part of the system, but a person who is held accountable." She turned to the judicial officers. "Enforce the sentence." Once again, the handcuffs clamped around Colleen's wrists. This time, a sentence that could not be undone. She was led away, each step slow, as though dragging her entire past behind her. But when Colleen's back disappeared behind the final door, there was no scorn, no applause, just a silent gaze. because the price she paid wasn't 12 years. It was the absolute end of the privileges that had shielded her from consequence. And when Alexandria sat back down in her chair, her back straight, her head slightly bowed, she gently closed her eyes. Not from exhaustion, not from satisfaction, but because she knew that today justice was not about revenge. It was about cleaning the dust off the scales of justice, so next time it would not tip. The next morning, the gentle golden sunlight stretched across the stone steps of the Lexington Federal Courthouse, as if the sun itself understood that today, this place was no longer an old building with moss-covered columns, but a place that had just witnessed a new definition being written. Justice was no longer an abstract concept. It now had a form, a voice, and a name, Alexandria Rhodes. She walked through the main door as she did every morning, without any bodyguards, without an escort, without cameras following her. But when she entered the grand hall, what happened made Alexandria pause for a moment. The entire hall, from the clerks, administrative staff, and security guards to a janitor cleaning windows at the end of the hallway, stood up straight. No one gestured. There was no bell to announce it, no directive from the PA system. But they all rose at once, like a silent consensus, stemming from deep within the hearts of those who were witnessing something they had never seen in their entire lives. A judge who not only renders justice, but lives and endures for it. Alexandria didn't smile. She simply nodded, then continued walking. But her eyes stopped when she passed a hallway leading to the auxiliary workspace. There, a man in a Navy uniform, a thin, dark-skinned janitor with silver-speckled hair, stood motionless, one hand still holding his mop, the other pressed firmly against his chest. No one spoke, but his eyes conveyed something that couldn't be written in any file, couldn't be spoken in the media. You made me believe I deserve respect. One step further, Alexandria saw the same teenage girl from a few days ago, the one who had stood in the square, looking up at her through the third-floor window. Now the girl was inside the court, holding a notebook, standing silently beside a stone pillar like a determined student. When their eyes met again, the girl didn't say a word, only smiled. And in that smile was everything, the resurrection of faith. Faith that didn't come from flowery words, but from an action so genuine that no one could ignore it. Inside the courtroom, those who had once doubted Alexandria now sat still, attentively, no longer glancing at their phones or whispering to colleagues. Even the most conservative lawyers, the ones who had once scoffed at the Rhodes Act as emotionalizing the justice system, now sat upright, their eyes fixed on the woman who had turned injustice into a historic trial. Alexandria ascended the bench. She wasn't wearing her robe today, and she didn't need to. With her mere presence, she had already made it clear to the entire room. Justice didn't need to be cloaked. It needed to be seen, lived by, and protected by those brave enough to stand up, even when their heads had been shaved. Jasmine stood beside her, gently handing her the file. But instead of immediately sitting down, Alexandria turned back to face the entire room. "Previously," she began, her voice not loud but steady, "I thought of justice as the cold balance between the parties, a neutral standard, neither tilted nor emotional. But now I understand. Justice is not indifference organized by procedure. It is action. It is choice. It is courage." She paused briefly. We have allowed too many people to walk through this courthouse in silence because they had no power, no name, no title, and we thought this was normal. But no, it is normal when everyone is heard, even if they are not like anyone else in this courtroom. A young lawyer, who had once hesitated to sign the reform proposal, now looked at her in admiration. A retired judge sitting at the back of the public seats gave a subtle nod. Alexandria concluded with a simple statement: "Justice is no longer an ideal. It is standing right here, and it will not back down." When she sat down, no one told them to, but the entire room stood again, not because of the law, not because of tradition, but because of the dignity that had been awakened. In the days that followed, Alexandria's image, with her shaved head and determined gaze, appeared on the front pages of the New York Times, The Atlantic, and National Geographic. But she did not accept interview requests. She didn't sign books. She didn't hold press conferences. She simply continued working, quietly, accurately, impartially, like none of it had ever been an earthquake. But in the hearts of the people, every trial after that was never the same. Because from that day on, when someone mentioned justice in the Lexington Federal Court, they no longer thought of blindfolded statues with scales in their hands. They thought of one woman, with a shaved head and a heart that would never be subdued. The story of Judge Alexandria Rhodes was not just a case. It was a reminder that justice does not lie in statues, documents, or badges, but in how each of us dares to face injustice and never turn away. She walked into the courtroom as a victim, but left it as a living symbol of awakening. Not with anger, but with courage and determination, Alexandria made all of America look back. Not just at the system, but at themselves. What do you think is the biggest barrier that prevents justice from reaching everyone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel to continue telling stories of truth and humanity. Justice is no longer an abstract concept. It now has a face, and that face is walking with us.